What is up, my friends, and how's it going? And welcome back to another episode on the Army Guide series with your fellow comrade Summary. In today's episode, we will be going over the Carthaginian faction. But before we hop on to section 1, in which we will look over the Carthaginian roster and analyze each and every single unit, let us quickly hop into the custom battle page to get a feel for the actual size of the Carthaginian roster. And as you can see over here, it is massive, and I can't even fit all of the units into a single battle, even with the large armies option selected. However, that being said, what I am going to do is I am going to break down section 1 into 2 parts, and I am going to try to be quick about it, or else this episode will take forever. In the first part, what we are going to do is we are going to look at all of our units from our generals all the way down to our phalanx infantry, and in the second part we will look at missile infantry all the way down to our special elephant units. However, that being said and done, let us hurry up. Let us jump right into it, and I will see you all in section 1. Alright, so welcome to section 1. We are going to take a look at the roster and analyze each and every single unit for the Carthaginian faction. And as you can see, I have gone ahead and deployed my army in that typical formation that I did in our Spartan episode. And as you can see, generals in the front, melee infantry behind them, spear units, and then phalanx infantry. And without any further ado, let us quickly analyze the Carthaginian faction. But before we go ahead and do that, I want to make a small mention. With the Carthaginian faction, you have several prefixes in front of a unit. However, this is not always necessarily the case. But when you do see the prefix Carthaginian, that means that this unit actually draws from the first class population. When you see the prefix of Libby Phoenician, that means it draws from the second class population, like this unit over here. When you see the prefix of Libyan, then it draws from the third class population. And finally, when you see the prefix of mercenary, it also draws from the third class population. And that is because Carthage, much like Rome, has access to a special barracks. And in the case of Carthage, it is not an auxiliary barracks that gives access to population 4 units, but rather a mercenary barracks that gives access to mercenary units that are of population 3. Which is why I rank Carthage slightly below Rome in terms of, how powerful their roster is. And that is because the Carthaginian version of the Auxilia actually draws from the third class instead of the fourth class population. However, that being said and done, without further ado, let us have a quick look at the very first unit of our general. And over here we have the Carthaginian Sacred Band. And of course, you can see that Hellenic influence. This is a hoplite unit and one of the best hoplite units in the game. And they do have a respectable melee attack of 8, melee defense of 17, really good weapon damage of 28, good armor, good morale, all around a very good unit. And of course, they are also resistant to heat, which is quite useful for the Carthaginian faction since you start out in Africa where there are a lot of deserts. Next up, we have the Carthaginian General's Bodyguard, and these guys are pretty good, really good stats, and I would recommend them over, of course, your Carthaginian Sacred Band, because when it comes to infantry, you don't want them as your general unit. You typically want to have cavalry units so that they are easier to escape from a bad situation, easier to approach a dire situation, and perhaps inspire or rally the troops. So definitely you want cavalry, and always you want cavalry, because just that more mobility is what makes cavalry worth it. However, with the Carthaginian General's Bodyguard, as you can see over here, they have good melee attack, very good melee defense, overall a very good weapon damage at 32, decent armor, and a pretty low speed rather, but that is pretty much going to be the speed of all heavy cavalry units. Next up, we come to our final option for the start game, which is the Carthaginian Sacred Band Cavalry, which is pretty much the Sacred Band but a mounted version. They have slightly lower melee attack and melee defense in comparison to your Carthaginian General's Bodyguard. They have just slightly lower weapon damage as well, but they make up for it with armor. So it's pretty much a toss-up between these two units, which one you want to get. And you might be inclined towards getting the Carthaginian General's Bodyguard. However, me personally, I like to go for the Sacred Band Cavalry cavalry because there is a late variant of this unit that you can upgrade during the thorax reforms. Next up, we have the Carthaginian Citizen Cavalry late, and these guys, these generals, are your only options for your generals during the Thurius reforms. However, you still have access to your older options, so I would stick with the older options because these guys are actually Lancer Cavalry, and as Lancer Cavalry, they have really poor defensive capabilities, which means should they find themselves in a sticky situation, you could end up losing your general. So definitely don't get these guys. However, they do enjoy that extra mobility, and one thing you will notice about the Carthaginian faction is that most of its units have the resistance to heat. Next up, we move to our final two options for our thorax reforms, starting with, of course, the upgrade of the Carthaginian Sacred Band, and this is a more thoraxy kind of looking of unit, and as you can see, they have that Celtic chainmail armor donned on and some Hellenic influence, as well as that scutum shield. However, don't be fooled by the scutum. They are still a hoplite phalanx unit, and these guys are really good hoplite phalanx units. They are even comparable to the Spartan Hippeis or the Royal Spartan Bodyguard. However, they only come as 200 men strong, so yes, and once again, they are an infantry unit, so I wouldn't recommend them as a general unit. However, lastly, we have access to the Carthaginian Sacred Band Cavalry, the late version of the earlier version. Now, these guys are better all round. They have better melee attack, about the same melee defense, and they share the same weapon damage as, of course, the Carthaginian General's Bodyguard. And, of course, they have a lot more armor. So these guys are, without a shred of doubt, your absolute best option, but they are only available to you during your thorax reforms. Now, unlike the Hellenic factions, which get access to their Thurius reforms at turn 40 if you're the human player, or sorry, turn 50 if you're the human player, and turn 120 if you're talking about the thorax reforms, with the Carthaginians, those reforms are slightly delayed at turn 60 and turn 130 respectively. However, that being said and done, let us hop on to the next section, which is our melee infantry. With our melee infantry, we start up with the Libyan infantry. These guys come from the third class population. I wouldn't even consider these units because they have really a poor melee attack and melee defense, so they're pretty much very useless. You might even find some missile units with better melee attack and defense stats. They do have 300 men, but they don't have any ammunition, which puts them in the category of completely useless. Next up, we have our Mercenary Iberian Swordsmen. Now, these guys have slightly better melee attack at 12, which is quite respectable for a swords unit. Low melee defense, slightly better armor, the same amount of speed 3, but their weapon damage is at 26, which I do not consider to be particularly very good. So again, I wouldn't recommend getting these guys in the early game. Next up, we have the Mercenary Scutari. These guys also come from the third class population, having that mercenary prefix, and these guys are actually better than the first two units. They have a melee attack of 13, a melee defense of 11, a total weapon damage of 30, which is respectable, 25 armor, which is also quite good. However, they do have slower movement speed. And these guys are more legionary styled units, as in they are not offensively oriented. They're more like a frontline unit, but of course, as Carthage, you do have access to a lot of hoplite options as well as spear options. So I wouldn't really consider these guys to be frontline units. They could be very useful in scaling the walls during a siege. However, next up, we have the Mercenary Iberian Champions. Now, these guys are absolute badasses. I mean, look at that melee attack of 18. What's more is that they do have that hide, and they do also have guerrilla deployment. Unlike, your Iberian options do have that guerrilla deployment, which is quite useful because these guys can be placed forward or in a good position to hide. Apart from that, they also get, insane amount of melee attack. As I mentioned, melee defense is pretty respectable. Their weapon damage is at 30, which is equivalent to the Scutari, but 4 out of that is armor penetration as opposed to 2 in the case of the Scutari. What's more is that they have 35 armor. And of course, let's go ahead, toggle everyone's melee mode on so you can get to see their swords instead of their javelins. And what's more is that they have a speed of 3, so these units are absolutely amazing at flanking and they can do some pretty significant damage on the flanks. Next up, we unlock the Libyan Turios infantry. Now these guys are available during the Turios reforms, and the Libyan prefix means they do come from that third class population. They are pretty similar to your Hellenic Turios infantry, however they do only have a single ammunition, so I wouldn't really recommend this unit, especially since you have better third class options, alternatives in your mercenary alternatives. And this is a scene you will be seeing a lot with the Carthaginian army, is that your mercenary troops are typically better than your core troops. And what's more is that the Carthaginian faction actually gets a lot of buffs and benefits to using mercenary troops, so I would always recommend using mercenary troops over your core roster. However, next up we have the Libyan Phoenician Turios infantry. And with Libyan Phoenician, that means population 2. Turios should mean Turios, but don't be fooled by that. In the case of these Turios infantry, they come actually once you access your thorax reforms. They are pretty much similar to your Libyan Turios infantry. However, they have the same stats and just an armor of 30, which is in slight increment. And considering that they come from the second class population, if given a choice, I would bite the bullet and take the lower armor and third class population unit versus the exact same unit for 15 armor coming from the second class of population. So definitely don't get these guys, in my opinion. Next up we have the Libyan Phoenician Thorax Swordsmen. Now these guys are quite similar to your Roman legionaries. They do come from that second class population. They are unlocked during the thorax reforms. They have that melee attack of 14, melee defense of 11, which is quite respectable. Their overall damage is 27, which is a bit on the lower end, but they have decent armor at 38 and a speed of 2. So these are quite similar to your Roman legionaries. Of course, they even look like Roman legionaries with the exception of some Punic influence and some Hellenic influence in their armors. And with that, we have completed the melee infantry section. So let's hop on to the spear infantry. With the spear infantry, we have the mercenary African levies. These guys are trash. I don't want to go through their stats. You can see for yourself. They have low melee attack, low bonus versus cavalry, and as such, they are absolutely garbage. And of course, very low melee defense. Next up, we have the Libyan spearmen, also coming from the third class of population, and they are very identical to your mercenary African levies, with the exception of that 8 armor as opposed to 1 armor. So once again, a trash unit. Do not get this unit when you have better third class population alternatives. Next up, this is where things start to get interesting. We have mercenary Celtic spearmen. And in the case of mercenary Celtic spearmen, they also come from the third class population. And as you can see, they have better stats overall, good damage versus cavalry and elephants. When you add that up with their melee attack, that's a total melee attack of 24 against cavalry. And when you add that up with their weapon damage, that is a total weapon damage of 43, as opposed to, in the case of these guys, you have 13 plus 36, so 43 and 36, that's a world of a difference. However, moving on to the next unit, you have the mercenary Ligurian spearmen. Now with these guys, they have better stats in comparison to their Celtic counterparts. However, they do have only 200 men per unit, so they are slightly compromised in that department. However, when it comes to the bonus versus cavalry, they do shine, and as you can see, they have a 21 bonus versus cavalry, and of course even better overall weapon damage, which means against cavalry units, these guys will actually do 49 damage, which is insane per hit. And of course their melee attack will be at 29, which is much better than 24. So these guys are actually very good at countering cavalry, so I would typically use them on the flanks of my core phalanx units. Of course, the Carthaginian core is going to be filled with phalanx units because those units are the best at holding the line. However, you can opt for mercenary Ligurian spearmen should you choose to protect your flanks. Speaking of protecting the flanks and countering enemy cavalry, we have Next up, the Mercenary Naked Spear Throwers, also from your population class 3. Now these guys are absolutely insane. They don't have any armor, they are naked. They do have Impetuous, which means they get extra morale bonus when eager. However, that doesn't really matter because their morale is quite good. They do have really good speed, and they have 2 ammunition, which means they have 400 javelins, which is also quite respectable. But what's special about these units is that they have good bonus versus cavalry and good melee attack, and that means they have a total melee attack of 30 versus cavalry and elephants. And meanwhile, their weapon damage is actually 32, which is very high for a spear unit. It's very rare to see a spear unit with so high weapon damage, of which 4 is armor penetration. In fact, no unit we have seen so far has 32 weapon damage. So these guys are pretty much top of the rank right there. And when you add that 32 with 20, you're looking at 52 damage versus cavalry units. Next up, we move to the Turius reforms. We get access to the Libyan Turius spearmen coming from your 3rd class population. These guys are not worth it. They are very similar to your Hellenic counterparts. However, again, as you have better access to better 3rd class population units in the form of your mercenaries, I would stay away from these units. Next up, we have our final 2 units, which we will get during our Thorax reforms with the Libyan-Phoenician Turius spears, similar to the Libyan-Phoenician Turius swordsmen. Don't be fooled by the word Turius. These guys are unlocked during the Thorax reforms. They are 300 men strong, and like in the case of the swordsmen, they are very similar to the Libyan Turius spearmen in that their only benefit is that they have a plus 30 armor. However, it's not worth it considering that they do come from that 2nd class population being Libyan Phoenicians. So definitely, once again, I would not recommend these guys. Finally, we have the Libyan Phoenician Thorax spears. These guys come from your 2nd class population, and as you can see, they have that chainmail kind of a look. A very, very, very nice looking unit. I really like the scutum. These units are quite worth it. They can be a frontline unit, and despite them being a spearman, because they actually have access to that defensive formation, and what's more is they also have access to hollow square. So these guys are quite similar to the Hellenic Thorax spearmen that you get. Now these guys are quite good at the flanks. However, once again, I might not recommend them for use on the flanks because they do come from the 2nd class population. And who exactly are you protecting? Your 3rd class population. So you're pretty much, because your 3rd class population is forming your core. So you're pretty much using a higher population class to protect your lower population class, which makes no sense. So once again, we may use these units, however, it is quite situational. And finally, we are going to move on to our phalanx category. And in our phalanx category, we start off with the Libyan hoplites coming from the 3rd class population unit. These guys are a hoplite unit, and they are not a very good one at that, so I'm not going to break it down with these guys. A very poor melee defense of 14. Do not, absolutely do not get this unit. Absolutely trash tier. Good looking unit though, but not very good on the battlefield. Next up, we have the Carthaginian hoplites. Stat-wise, very similar to the Libyan hoplites. They do have better armor and slightly better morale. However, as the word Carthaginian suggests, they come from the 1st class population, and considering stat-wise they're comparable to the Libyan hoplites, this means that this Carthaginian hoplite is in fact worse than the Libyan hoplite unit. So absolutely avoid this unit at all costs. Now, when it comes to your hoplite units, you might think that the first 2 options are quite bad, so what the hell? However, when we move to our 3rd option, we have the mercenary Greek hoplites. Stat-wise, they're quite similar to the Carthaginian hoplites. They do have better morale, and of course they have better armor. But being a mercenary unit, they come from that 3rd class population. And for a 3rd class population hoplite, these guys are absolutely phenomenal. So definitely these guys will be forming up the core of your infantry during the early game as Carthage. And as you are able to build a higher level of mercenary barracks, you will unlock an absolute monster. And that monster is the mercenary heavy Celtic spearmen. Now, of course, in patch 1.3.2, I have convinced the team to give these heavy Celtic spearmen the shield wall formation, which is the barbaric equivalent of a hoplite phalanx, because it doesn't make sense that their Celtic counterparts have the ability whereas these guys don't. So now these units are actually a phalanx or a shield wall type unit, and their stats are across the board much better than the first 3 hoplite, as you can see over here. They have 8 melee attack, 19 melee defense, 30 armor, which is slightly lower, but amazing bonus versus elephants. And of course their weapon damage is almost at 30, it is at 28, and a pretty fantastic looking unit overall. So definitely I would recommend getting this unit as your main frontline unit when you can get access to that level 4 mercenary barracks. However, that being said and done, let's move on to the final unit of the starting game, which is the Carthaginian Sacred Band. And I'm not going to break down these units. Of course, they are not as good as your Mercenary Celtic Spearmen, and these guys actually come from the 3rd class population, versus the Sacred Band, which has the Carthaginian prefix, comes from the 1st class population. And the reason I'm not breaking them down is because we have already covered them in the Generals unit. Next up, during the Turius reforms, we get access to the Libby Phoenician Hoplite. Now the Libby Phoenician Hoplite do have decent stat. They are a population 2 type unit. However, their stats once again are not comparable to your Mercenary Heavy Celtic Spearmen. So definitely the Mercenary Heavy Celtic Spearmen are better. However, if you want to spread out your population, since you don't want to too heavily focus on getting entirely mercenary type units, you can mix it up with a few Libby Phoenician Hoplite. Next up, we have our final phalanx unit, and this is the Carthaginian Sacred Band, which is the late version of it, which is unlocked during the Thorax reforms. And I have already covered this unit during our time when we had a look at the general unit. So it's pretty much the same unit, nothing much to see over here. Stat wise, of course, these guys are without a doubt the best unit of all the phalanx units, including your Mercenary Heavy Celtic Spearmen. However, keep in mind that these are Carthaginian, so they come from the 1st class population as opposed to the Mercenary Heavy Celtic Spearmen. I might actually suggest, if you're trying to go for a historical army composition, the Carthaginians were known for having 1 sacred band per army. However, it is, it's not really confirmed all that much, since no one knows much about the Carthaginian army. But should you decide to fall on that side of the fence, then you can go ahead and get these guys as one of your main core line units. However, that being said and done, let us quickly hop out of the battle, hop into the next battle, where I will be covering the other half of the Carthaginian roster. Alright, welcome to the second part. We have lined up the remaining units, starting with our missile infantry, our melee cavalry, missile cavalry, chariots, and finally elephants. So let's hop right into it. For our missile infantry, the first option we have is the Libyan javelin men. These guys come from population 3. Nothing nothing fancy to talk about them. They are very generic skirmisher type unit. Moving on to our next unit, we have the mercenary Numidian javelin men. Stat wise, they are pretty similar to your first option. However, they are mercenary, which also means they come from the same population class. They do benefit from faster shots per minute, and of course a better range and better missile damage, better attack. So all around just slightly better. So I would call these guys slightly above average, to say the least. And if given a choice between these two, definitely go for the mercenary Numidian javelin men. Next up, we have the Libyan archers. Nothing fancy about these guys. They have a very generic stats across the board. And yeah, I wouldn't really recommend getting these guys. However, should you need to have an archer unit in case of requiring that flaming shot, so that you can burn down wooden fortifications as well as defenses during a siege battle against a wooden settlement, archers can be quite handy. Next up, we have Libyan slingers, and nothing fancy about these guys. These are also very generic slinger units, and they also come from the 3rd class population unit. So I'm not going to go dive too much into depth of this unit. Melee wise, they pretty much have nothing to offer. Next up, we have the mercenary Balearic slingers. Now Carthage gets access to these slingers as a factional sort of thing, and these guys are considered to be alongside, of course, your Rhodian slingers, the best slinger unit in the game bar none. They have increased missile damage versus most of the other slingers, which means they have 7 armor piercing, which is phenomenal for a ranged unit. And that also means that if you use these guys in the backs of heavily armored units, they will inflict some serious punishment. Meanwhile, their range is at 215, which is quite good because they can get some early shots off against the enemy unit. And slingers, in my opinion, are really good in open field battles because as opposed to archers, because of that armor penetration and of course that range, which means the main advantage of slingers is to kind of try to snipe out enemy cavalry units and enemy general units before they can get or engage with your cavalry units. And you may not inflict any casualties against those cavalry units, however you will significantly deplete their health pool thanks to that armor penetration. So slingers can be quite useful against cavalry units, and especially more powerful against ranged cavalry units like skirmisher cav and of course horse archers. Next up, during the Turios reforms, you get access to the Libyan peltas. Now these guys are a slightly better version of the Peltaste units, very similar to you know, the Peltastes that you get with your Hellenic counterparts. They have decent melee attack, decent melee defense, a decent weapon damage of 26, and of course the other stats are quite generic for a skirmisher unit. Next up, we move on to the Carthaginian archers. Now, having the word Carthaginian in it might mean that these guys actually come from the first class population. However, I do believe they come from that second class population. I'm not entirely sure. But if they come from the second class population, these guys are quite good archers, as Carthage doesn't have access to many other good archer units. As you can see, we only have access to a Libyan archer, which is not that good. However, these guys have similar stats, but what sets them apart is of course that 25 armor value. Lastly, when it comes to missile units, we have access to the Libyan Phoenician peltas, and these guys come from that second class population unit. They are very respectable second class population units. They have 30 armor, very good melee attack and very good melee defense, good amount of ammunition, good damage for that ammunition. So we could use these guys for our second class units that we are so desperately searching to find. Next up, we will move into the cavalry section, and in the cavalry section you have access to Libyan cavalry. These guys are a melee cavalry with pretty respectable stats for a melee cavalry unit. They do come at 120 men per unit, and considering they are pop 3 cavalry with a speed of 7, they are quite good against lightly armored units. However, they will not be good against heavily armored cavalry units. Next up, we get access to the Mercenary Iberian cavalry. These guys also come from the second class population and are overall slightly better than your Libyan variants in that they have more armor, and of course they are also remain to be at 120 men per unit. Next up, we have the Carthaginian citizen cavalry. I'm not going to dive into this cavalry unit. It's pretty useless. Shock cavalry unit means it's extremely fragile, and they do come from that first class population, so definitely don't get these guys. Not worth it in my opinion. Next up, we have what I consider to be one of the best melee cavalries for the Carthaginian faction, and that is your Mercenary Iberian heavy cavalry. For those of you you know, who have seen my Roman episode number 6, you will see that these guys can pretty much do quite well, as they have 49 armor, 57 charge. So these guys are more of a shock kind of a unit, although they do have a small shield. So they are kind of like that hybrid between a melee cavalry as well as a shock cavalry. These guys are overall, in my opinion, one of the best cavalry units you can get as Carthage. Next up, we have the Carthaginian General's Bodyguard, and I'm not going to cover this unit in detail because we have seen it in the previous section. I mean, in the same section, but the first part, they are a general unit. And also the same goes with the Carthaginian Sacred Band Cavalry. Next up, during the Furious reforms, we get access to the Libby Phoenician cavalry. Now these guys come from that second class population, and they are pretty much very generic melee cavalry units. So once again, wouldn't really recommend getting these units because they come from that second class population. And of course, you have a better option in your mercenary Iberian heavy cavalry. Next up, the last final two options we have are actually the same general units. This one over here is the Carthaginian Citizen Cavalry Late, which is available as a shock cavalry unit during your Furious reforms. And the last one is of course the Carthaginian Sacred Band Cavalry, the late version that is available during your Thorax reforms, which is an upgrade of the starting version of the same unit over here. Moving on to the next unit, which is our Missile Cavalry, we have only one option, which is our Numidian Cavalry, and they are very lightly armored. However, they do have a lot of good and useful traits down here at the bottom. They have that fire whilst moving, Parthian shot, resistance to heat, snipe, which means they can fire while still being hidden. They have the stock ability, they have the special Numidian horse entity, which means they have increased mass and charge speed. They have a very respectable speed of 8, 120 men per unit. These guys are really good skirmisher cavalry units, but that being said and done, they have absolutely zero capability of being in a melee engagement. I would, if I had to use them in a melee engagement, use them against extremely lightly armored missile units of the enemy faction. However, that being said and done, these guys, if supplemented by a bunch of melee troops to support them, should they find themselves caught out in a melee engagement, they can do pretty well. And the melee unit that comes to mind is of course that naked mercenary Gallic spearman. Next up, we have chariots, and chariots are, for most of you who have seen my Mauryan series will know that chariots can rack up even more kills than elephant units that are in the back over there. However, these chariots, while being heavy and while being scythed, they are only 25 men per unit, which means any losses and they will pretty much rout from the battlefield. They do have the scare everyone ability and of course the trample or the mighty knockback effect, which means that these units can rack up insane amount of kills. However, with chariots you need to be extremely micro intensive, and if you're not paying attention you can pretty much lose your chariots without even getting to use them in the battle. However, that being said and done, just keep in mind that chariots are also extremely expensive to maintain, and as the prefix does mention Carthaginians, these guys come from the first class population, so maybe not a good idea to get these units. However, if you fancy, go ahead and get these units. And the reason I wouldn't recommend these units is because as Carthage you get access to African elephants. Now they may not be as good as the Indian elephants or the Syrian elephants, which are pretty much a hybrid of the Indian elephants. African elephants are still elephants, and nonetheless these guys are nothing to scoff at. And with elephants we have three options, beginning with your African elephants. Now these guys are the cheapest options available. They are available to you at the start of the campaign, and they're quite good and quite respectable elephant units. However, they are not as tough as some of your other elephant options available. Moving on to the next option available, we have the African War Elephant, and when it says African, that also means it comes from the third class population. Now with the African War Elephants, they have slightly better stats and they are 18 men per unit. However, don't let that confuse you, and I'll explain that in a bit. They have pretty much similar stats. Upkeep wise they are slightly more, so I mean it's pretty much a toss-up between either or, but what really sets these elephants apart is their base morale. As elephants tend to have very finicky morale, I would suggest that you have a better morale. And of course the two most important stats for your elephants are going to be the elephant morale and that melee defense, and as you can see they have better melee defense, better morale, so overall these African War Elephants are better. And next up we finally have the Carthaginian Atlas Elephants. Now these guys, I do believe they come from the second class if not the first class population. However, it doesn't matter. These guys have a special elephant entry, which is the Carthaginian Atlas Elephant entry, which means that they are better than African elephants. However, not as good as Indian elephants, but still quite a close competitor to your Indian and Syrian elephants. Now these guys are slightly armored, and of course at the same time they do have 36 men per unit, but that doesn't mean that they have more elephants. As you can see over here, elephant wise, you're looking at pretty much the same amount of elephants in all three of the elephant options. However, when you do see this 36 number, just pay close attention and you might notice that they have ammunition. What that means is that they actually have, apart from the rider and his elephant, they actually have a missile unit on the top in a howdah or a elephant tower that can hurl a missile. In this case it is a javelin unit. However, some elephants do have access to archers. Now this this elephant unit is without doubt the best available Carthaginian elephant that you have. They do have a melee defense of 8, which is a notch above the African war elephant, and at the same time they have better base morale. So definitely get these elephants if you can. However, that being said, they are very expensive to maintain, but it shouldn't be much of a problem if you follow my economic kind of a playthrough as you see in my Let's Play series, and of course select some skills that will help out with that army upkeep cost reduction. However, that being said and done, we are finally done looking through the entire and massive Carthaginian roster. So let us hop on to the next section, which is pretty much the army composition of the Carthaginians that I personally recommend. Alright, welcome to the second section of the Carthaginian army guide. We are going to discuss the army composition for the late Carthaginian army. And we are facing off, of course, against a Marian Legion unit. Now, when it comes to Carthage, we have access to a lot of good mercenary units. However, we want to minimize our first class population and maximize our third and foreign class population units. However, we don't have access to any foreign class population units over here. So the breakdown is going to be a 50-50 split for this battle, in which I mean to say the first 50% of your army is going to be first and second class population units, and the second 50% will be third class population units, more or less. However, we can go ahead and get some more third class population units from our mercenary barracks. And starting off with the Carthaginians, I like to first off get that core infantry unit, and we are going to get about 3 Gallic shield wall units over here, mercenary heavy Celtic spearmen, and to complement them we are going to get a Carthaginian sacred band, which is first class population unit. And what I am going to do as Carthage is that you have options of really good melee infantry units, so we are going to go ahead and get some Iberian champions for the flanks. We can get about 4 of them, which means I can perhaps get another mercenary heavy Celtic spearman. Now, what we can also do as Carthage is get access to Libby Phoenician peltastae and a couple of Balearic slingers. Make sure I, just for the sake of being able to see what we have here more clearly, put them down over there. As far as melee cavalry is concerned, we can get a couple of these Iberian heavy cavalry units. Maybe just 1 Carthaginian elephant, Atlas elephant. We don't need 2, as it would be quite expensive to maintain. Maybe a couple of these Numidian cavalrymen, as they are going to be quite crucial. And what we can also do is get access to those naked spearmen. They were quite good actually. Naked spear throwers, okay. So the idea is to pretty much support our mercenary Iberian heavy cavalry with these naked spear throwers, and we could actually support them with, of course, our elephant unit over here. So you know what, I am actually going to put them over there. Meanwhile, the peltas, we might not need the peltas. What we could do is get rid of a couple of peltas, get perhaps maybe 1 more of these mercenary, and maybe even 1 more elephant. So with that, we are looking at about 6 cavalry units, which seems to be quite normal for Carthage. And we have a lot of spear units as well as some slinger units. And with that, I think it's quite good. I like this army composition. And we can go ahead and hop into a battle, and I will show you how I go ahead and use this army composition. Alright, welcome to the battle. Let us select our entire army and deploy them all the way in the back so that we have a clean working space. Go ahead and hide that tooltip as well. General in group 1, Balearic Slingers group 2, Elephants, since we have 2 of them, they're going to be group 3 and 4. Cavalry on the right flank, I believe, should be our heavy shock cavalry. Meanwhile, on the left flank, we want our spearmen, as well as our Numidian cavalry, as well as now on the right flank we want our Iberian cavalry. Next up, we are going to set up our center to be consisting of our phalanx type units, and we can spread out the front line a little bit more so that it's a bit more wider. I believe maybe we can even do it more wider. Sorry, there we go. So there it is, a bit more wider. And we are gonna split up our champions, our Iberian champions, into 2 flanks. We have our left flank over here, and meanwhile we have the right flank over here. Being said and done, we can go ahead, deploy our slingers behind. Go ahead, deploy our slingers behind. Our general also behind, all the way in the back. So as you can see, we are starting to form that formation with the Carthaginians, and this is what I actually like to do with the Carthaginians, and I'll explain shortly why. I do know with the Spartans I went with that oblique order. Meanwhile, let's form up our left flank, and on the left flank we are going to put our naked spearmen over here, our naked spear throwers, and we're going to toggle off that fire at will. And we're going to put our Numidians as well over here. Toggle off that fire at will, put them on melee mode. Put these guys on melee. We don't need to put them on melee, I think. Oh, actually we need to. Yes, we need to put them on melee mode. Meanwhile, on the right flank, get another elephant unit over there. And finally, our cavalry unit to support that elephant unit. That being said and done, this is the overall formation. And the idea of this formation is pretty much have a versatile army, a very versatile army that can be used in multiple scenarios. However, the idea is to attack the flanks as quickly as possible, gain that cavalry supremacy. On the left flank, what we are going to do is attack a cavalry with the elephant and get our spearmen in there and see how well they do against the enemy cavalry units. Meanwhile, we can also charge our Numidians in there, and Numidians will be really good at chasing down enemy cavalry because keep in mind they have that extra speed. Meanwhile, on the right flank, the elephant will charge the cavalry as well. However, that charge will be followed up by our heavy Iberian mercenary cavalry, which are a shock cavalry, so they will do pretty significant damage. Meanwhile, in the center, this is what is going to happen. We have our core and we have our left and right flanks for that center. The core is pretty much going to eat up most of the enemy infantry, and that's why they are a little bit advanced. Meanwhile, our flanks are slightly declined because what we are going to do is we are going to move our flanks once the entire enemy front line is engaged and encircle the enemy. And once that happens, our cavalry all the way out on either flank should be pretty much done, and they should be able to come back in. So what you will end up having is a kind of cauldron over here, or a kind of a reverse curve or concave, and our cavalry charging into the center, which is very much a Kene inspired sort of a battle tactic. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and start the battle. Select our army, move them forward really slow, and due to the battle map, which I am trying to stick to battle maps that are typical of the starting location of the faction, due to the dip in the battle map, we can't really see where the Roman army is at. However, we are just fast forwarding it over here so that hopefully we will discover the Roman army quite soon. However, just look at these Gallic units. They are absolutely one of my favorite units of the Carthaginian army. Just having that access to such superior third class phalanx infantry units is so amazing. However, I still can't see the Roman army, and we are just about there to see the Roman army. So quickly go ahead, keep marching our troops forward. We need to keep a look at our unit range. And the minute our Iberian slingers get into range, which I believe should be somewhere about here, the enemy should try to engage us. So we got to be a little bit careful. What we are going to do is slow down the battle. As you can see, the enemy will start to engage us. Quickly move up our troops. Quick look at our left and right flanks. As you can see over here on the left flank, we have a bunch of heavy shock troops. We can select our group 8 and go ahead and deploy shield wall in the case of our Gallic mercenary spearmen, and in the case of our Carthaginian sacred band we can activate that hoplite formation. Meanwhile, what we are going to do over here is slightly advance our left flanks. We don't really care, we can be slightly more offensive with our units. And we're going to select the entire center by drag clicking it like this and keep moving them up forward so that the enemy kind of engages us. Meanwhile, elephants over here can begin to attack. Go ahead. I have no idea what the AI is up to over here. However, my units are also acting a little bit weird. So let's just sort that out real quick. And the AI has completely moved its cavalry. I don't know where exactly. It's moved it somewhere in the center. And as such, we kind of have to wait and see what's going on over here. And once the enemy cavalry comes to the flanks, then we can proceed with our plan. Meanwhile, our center can keep progressing. Slingers are firing into the enemy units. Over here we have our spearmen. Quickly get into position, quickly move our cavalry into position. Keep looking at the bottom right corner, and I cannot stress this enough. It is so helpful during a battle. Keep looking at your UI. Your UI is basically your information, and without that information you can pretty much find yourself in a very bad spot. Meanwhile, over here you can see the enemy units have sort of kind of moved in a weird way. We are going to keep our slingers put as we don't really need to move them. Meanwhile, we can move our melee troops up ahead. And as you can see, this enemy unit is already trying to prevent that encirclement. However, they are not going to be very successful at it, because once my phalanx troops get into range, it's going to pretty much draw out the entire enemy over here. Just nicely stay put. And as you can see, the enemy cavalry has started to charge. So go ahead, charge with our elephants. The main purpose of our elephants is to break the charge. We're going to charge over here, select 2 of these units over here. Elephants have broken the charge, so now our spearmen can get into combat. And we quickly move our elephants slightly out over there, because they are getting hit by a lot of javelins. Meanwhile, our Numidian cavalry can also charge into the fray. Alright, quick look of what's going on over here. Iberian cavalry has charged in. Other Iberian cavalry can also charge in. And in the center, as you can see, some of these units are making a move. And quickly, this unit is trying to reach our Iberian swordsmen. So let's just try to intervene with our general unit. Quick look at the right flank. As you can see, the cavalry unit on the right flank is already routed, so we can move our Iberian cavalry out of the way. And as you can see, we are completely dealt with the enemy units. Meanwhile, over here, this unit is also losing decisively. Quickly charge over here, charge our elephants down over there. And as you can see, that on the right flank, we can slowly start to encircle the enemy. Meanwhile, we can do the same on the left flank. Slightly stay away from the enemy and keep hitting this unit. This is a heavy melee unit, so let's get out of there and quickly have a look at how we can deal with that situation. Meanwhile, pull back our general, pull back our Numidian cavalry. And over here, our spearmen can pretty much engage. We are going to toggle on that, that fire at will for the spearmen. We can charge our infantry into that. Quick look at the right flank. As you can see, our cavalry on the right flank is being caught up. So we are going to move our elephants as well. And the easiest way to do that is actually give them an order to attack another unit. Alright, so here we go. It looks like we are finally in a position to completely encircle the enemy army. However, over here, things are looking a little bit different. These units have engaged our flanking units, so we are going to, you know, have a slight difficulty with that. Meanwhile, our Numidians can also get into the battle. And as you can see, our naked spearmen doing a fantastic job against the cavalry unit over there. Quickly charge into the side of that unit. Get our elephants over here to help this unit get out. Use our slingers to kind of encircle or get that general unit. Meanwhile, our Numidians can also fire into that general unit. Toggle on that skirmish mode. Elephants have done well. These units can charge the flank. Meanwhile, this elephant unit can come here. Cavalry can get rid of that final cavalry unit. And we can pull our general behind. Get one more Iberian swordsman over here. Quick look at our map. There's only one unit all the way out over there. A couple of units are over here. However, we really quickly want to move our elephants. And perhaps we can move our elephants to charge this unit from multiple sides so that they are quickly taken out of the battle. Meanwhile, this unit is, of course, retreating as well. And our cavalry is done over here so they can get into the fight. And we have managed to lose a single elephant unit. However, it's not that big of a deal. And we are going to group our elephants into one group. And finally, we are going to charge into the backs of this melee unit. Keep pulling our elephants out. They are starting to take some significant damage. Keep firing over here. As you can see, we are nearly done with our encirclement. Our spearmen can also charge in. We are almost done with the encirclement. We're just waiting for our elephant units to move around. We can move our general as well. And of course, we are throwing our javelins into the backs of these units, and these units can charge here as well. And once we're done that, we will be able to do our encirclement of the Roman army. Fantastic. So we are done over here, which means our encirclement is almost ready. Get into that narrow formation so that we can begin to encircle the enemy. Get our cavalry over here, narrow formation here. Quickly begin to encircle the enemy. And our elephants are also poised for that encirclement. Now we can just simply move these units to encircle over here. Meanwhile, keep these units here and they can attack this unit. This unit can come here, attack this unit, and we are going to charge with our elephant units into the backs of these units with our Iberian cavalry as well. It's going to be a complete massacre over here. As you can see, the enemy is going to be completely surrounded, completely boxed in, and there's pretty much nothing they can do about that. And just like that, we have achieved a canny sort of a victory against the Romans. And if I actually continue the battle, it can be a pretty massive rout. Meanwhile, your Numidian cavalry, I forgot to do that. They can chase off stragglers because they have that speed 8. And they will have even greater speed when you have access to the stables, which improves the speed of your cavalry. And with that, I can pretty much just continue the battle real quick. However, I will see you all once the battle is done, and I will show you the stats of the kills. Alright, so as you can see over here, a super decisive victory against the Romans. We even had lesser troops against the Romans, and if you know that we actually played at Sparta, we took about 700 losses, but with the Carthaginians we took only 416. And of course, mainly the losses were incurred by our third class population, so quite easy to replenish. Would only take a couple of turns to replenish these troops, and if you have the right skills, it might even just take a single turn to replenish these troops. And overall, as you can see, every single troop has done their bit. Our Balearic Slingers racking up 200 kills in combination with each other. Elephants didn't do much, and you might think, well, that doesn't mean that elephants are not strong. Elephants can do significant amount of morale damage, and at the same time, if the battle lasted long, they would have done a lot more damage, because as you can see here, it is an 18-minute battle, which is pretty long. However, at the same time, you know, we didn't really get to charge into a massive blob of units with our elephants. We were using our elephants pretty much to protect our cavalry as well as our Numidians. The naked spear throwers actually did really good, considering most of these kills are actually cavalry units. And of course, as you look at our Iberian champions, 341, that is the second highest any unit has got of kills. However, the highest kills was of course the heavy Iberian Lancer cavalry. However, with that being said and done, let us hop on to the next section, which is pretty much the Mercenary and AOR units that I recommend for the Carthaginian faction. And honestly, you don't really need that many of them, considering that you have such amazing cavalry all across the board. Welcome to part 4 of the guide. We will be discussing about the Mercenary and AOR options for Carthage that I would personally recommend. When it comes to Carthage, as far as mercenaries are concerned, the world is your oyster. Literally just about any mercenary unit can be recruited and buffed to a respectable level, if not downright overpowered. This is because as Carthage, you have an overabundance of skills, technologies and army traditions that buff mercenaries. So much so that in this section I won't be covering any AOR units, because quite simply put, as Carthage you should be focused on stacking up as many mercenaries in your army as you possibly can. First, let's talk about the first set of provinces that is closest to your starting location. These include Hispania, Baetica and Libya. In Hispania and Baetica, you can recruit the Balearic Slingers, which is considered alongside the Rhodian Slingers to be the best in game. You can also access the Mercenary Iberian Infantry. These units are pretty offensively oriented with a melee attack of 16. Lastly, you can get access to the Turdetani Mercenary Spear Band, a shock spear unit with 12 melee attack, 25 armor, 29 overall melee damage, of which 6 is armor penetration, and most importantly 4 javelins, making them a very respectable flanking unit. Finally, in the province of Libya, you can get access to Greco-Libyan mercenary pikemen, and while these pikemen have pretty mediocre stats with the Carthaginian faction, as you will see in section 5 of the guide, they can pretty much become close to Silver Shield pikemen in stats. In the next set of provinces, you have Tarraconensis and Lusitania, and pretty much this gives you more access to Balearic Slingers as well as more mercenary Iberian infantry. Next up, you have the set of provinces that should be attainable before your Turius reforms around the mid-game. They include Narbonensis and Macedonia. In Narbonensis, you can get access to the mercenary Volcae veteran riders, which have the Maripos mount entry, while in Macedonia you can recruit the Macedonian mercenary pikemen, and of course my personal favorite, the Agrianian sellswords. Next up, we have provinces that are a little bit further away from our starting position, which will be attainable only in the late middle game just before your Thorax reforms. These include Gallia, Thrace, Hellas, Asia, Syria and Palmyra. In Gallia, you can recruit the Aedui free horsemen. Don't let the armor fool you, these guys have a good stat of 11 melee attack, 17 melee defense, the Maripos mount entry, but most importantly 120 men per unit. Meanwhile in Thrace, you can get access to more Agrianian sellswords as well as the Thracian mercenary warriors. In Hellas, you can recruit the Greek mercenary veteran Hoplite, which with the proper skills and army tradition can become the best hoplite units in the game, even better than the Royal Spartan bodyguard. Hellas in combination with Asia also gives you access to Cretan archers as well as Rhodian slingers. Finally, in the provinces of Syria and Palmyra, you can recruit Syrian mercenary archers. Finally, we have the provinces that are furthest away from our starting position, and depending on the direction of your earlier conquests may or may not be attainable in the late game well after your Thorax reforms. In the province of Caledonia and Hibernia, you get access to Gaelic mercenary chosen sword band. These guys are pretty much comparable to Roman legionaries and have decent overall stats. In the province of Belgica, you can recruit Belgae mercenary heavy lancers, which have the Maripos mount entry. Meanwhile, in Bithynia at Pontus and Galatia at Cappadocia, you can recruit the Cappadocian hired lancers that have a very heavy mount entry and a respectable shock cavalry stats. You can also get access to Galatian mercenary spearmen, which are a shock spear unit similar to the Turdetani mercenary spearband. However, in my opinion, not as good as the latter, does come with 4 javelins. Next up, in the province of Hayasdan, you can recruit the Armenian Azad cavalry with 120 men per unit, decent melee cavalry stats and a very heavy mount entry. In the province of Scythia, you can get access to the Scythian mercenary armored horse archers with 120 men per unit. This unit is a horse archer lancer cavalry hybrid with a very heavy mount entry that is better than the Maripos entry. Lastly, in the province of Parthava, you can recruit the Parthian hired cataphracts, a 120 men shock cavalry unit with the Nicaean mount entry, making it the best shock cavalry unit available as a mercenary. With that, I have covered all of the mercenary units I would personally find to be extremely good to get as Carthage. But as mentioned before, the world is your oyster when it comes to mercenary units as Carthage. And let's hop on to the next section to see why that is. Alright my friends, welcome to the 5th section of the Carthaginian army guide, and in this section we will be discussing the army traditions as well as the general skills, and I will just show you just how powerful these can be for the Carthaginian faction. In the previous section we did highlight some of the important mercenary units that we could get as Carthage. However, with Carthage, keep in mind the world is your oyster when it comes to mercenary units. As I have said before, you can get some pretty insane units. However, I have gone ahead and modded the game so that I own all provinces, just to show you how effective mercenaries can become if you are playing as the Carthaginian faction and you have spec'd your armies and general in the right fashion. However, when we start the Carthaginian campaign, we have 2 units that I would recommend getting rid of, and these are the Carthaginian hoplites and of course the Carthaginian citizen cavalry. Both of these guys come from your citizen or your first class population, and they're not really worth it, because if I have a look over here at the Carthaginian hoplites, as you can see, they have a melee attack of 7, melee defense of 17, armor of 32. And if I go ahead and try to recruit a mercenary, which is going to come from my second class of population, you can see the stats are pretty much identical. There is nothing that sets these 2 units apart, so you might as well use the second class population. Speaking of the mercenaries, Carthage as a faction gets access to factional mercenaries, as you can see over here. The first 4 mercenary units are the mercenary units in the province of Africa, followed by the other units that have this Carthaginian sort of a faction emblem on them. Can be recruited pretty much anywhere on the map as long as you own that settlement. And as you can see over here, we have all of these units as well available to Carthage regardless. And however, as you can see, before we reach that unit, the other units are pretty much your typical mercenary units that are from the province of Hispania. However, without any further ado, let us hop right into the army traditions first. And for the army traditions, of course, you want to get the special skill that you get for Carthaginians, and that is the Veteran Citizen Guards, which gives a -9 upkeep for all land units, a +9 melee defense for elephant units, and a +9 morale for all units. So these guys are, this tradition is absolutely important to get. However, it only unlocks at level 6. So you don't really get access to it the way I have. However, I have modded it in so that my general and my army are at maximum level. So we are going to next up select the Phoenician Guard, which gives a 3 melee attack skill for all mercenary units. Now, if you remember over here, and I'm going to show comparison pictures for how this mercenary Libby Phoenician mercenary hoplite will become even better than your Carthaginian hoplites due to our army traditions as well as our general skills. Meanwhile, in Africa, I've also gone ahead and given them a bunch of mercenary barracks. It's kind of bugged out the other 2 buildings over here. However, for the purpose of this video, it will do quite nicely. As you can see, we do have access to all of our mercenary units, including our mercenary heavy Celtic spearmen. And with all of these units, I'm going to show you a before and after of what happens to these units once I get all of the skills. And as you can already see, since I have selected this over here, which I believe, no, I haven't really selected anything. However, as you can see, we are going to go ahead and spec up our army traditions a bit further. Sorry, I had to turn off my cell phone. So go ahead with the Phoenician Vanguard. That will give me a more melee attack and melee skill for all mercenary units. Now this doesn't only apply to the mercenary units you can hire over here. As you can see, their melee attack has bumped up from 7 to 8. However, it will also affect the units that are within my own roster that are considered to be mercenary, such as the mercenary heavy Celtic spearmen, as they were previously before on 9, and now they have a melee attack of 10. Meanwhile, the mercenary Greek hoplite have a melee attack of 9, up from a melee attack of 10. The Iberian champions have 21, up from 20. So we are going to keep that in mind. As Carthage, you really want to maximize your skills for your mercenaries. Next up, we want to get the formidable fighters because it gives +3 melee attack skill for all units and melee defense for all units. So that is a very useful skill to have. And after that, we can also get the indomitable infantry. Even though this doesn't affect your entire army, it affects a vast majority of your army. At least 50% of your army should be infantry. So you're affecting a minimum of 50% of your army. Next up, we want to select the mercenary garrison, which gives a +3 melee defense skill for all mercenary units. Let's go ahead and get that. At the maximum, it gives +9. That's really good. Next up, we also want to get the stalwart city defenders, and though this might not seem as a good thing because it gives -12 attritional losses while under siege and 12 morale for all units within own or allied territory, both of which are not that useful, it does unlock the mercenary host, which gives a +9 melee attack and a melee defense skill for all mercenary units. Let's go ahead and get that. Next up, we want to get the Keepers of the Peace, because while this gives 6 morale and 9 public order, which isn't all that great, however, the 9 public order can be useful when conquering settlements in foreign territory and keeping that public order in check. What it does unlock is the foreign troop garrison. Now, while this gives a debuff of a -3 cultural conversion, it does give a -30 mercenary unit hiring cost, and it does give also a whopping 9% replenishment rate for all of your units. So you definitely want to get this. And now for the final skill, there's pretty much nothing you can get that is significantly better, but I would select between the frontier garrison, which gives extra campaign movement, or between the siege specialist. Me personally, I would go for the siege specialist. Not because we use any siege weapons, but that -15 attritional losses when besieging is quite good. And of course, we also get the +9 morale for elephant units. And now the reason being, as Carthage or as any other faction, I don't typically like to have field artillery because it's not very realistic, especially in battles. Historically, they were used very rarely at this point of time in history. So I tend to like to have, my regular armies besieging a wall settlement for a couple of turns. And especially if I have elephant units, getting a tortoise that can break down the walls is so good, because then your elephants can charge in the city and cause some damage. And that being said, the -15% attritional losses when besieging comes in handy. So let's go ahead and get this. Now finally we can move on to the general skills, and for the general skills, of course, we always want to get the military logistician, which gives that upkeep cost reduction. Let's go ahead and get that. We can also get the army replenishment rate, as well as the -5 non-mercenary recruitment cost. Let's go ahead and get that. Next up, we want to get the mercenary connections, which gives increased morale for all mercenary units, and of course a further reduction to our mercenary hiring costs. Now let's move on to the ferocious warrior next, which will unlock some of our abilities. And over here you can select the trained swordsman, that gives extra melee attack skill and defense skill of +9 for all infantry units, again affecting more than half of your army. And we have about 4 slots left, and the idea is to get the increased movement range and experience gain per turn in both of our fields over here. So let's go ahead and get that, because we want our armies to move extremely fast, because we are all about that mobility. I mean, I could go for the skilled cavalrymen, that's also quite helpful. However, in my opinion, getting that extra movement speed is just so crucial. And lastly, we can get the Dread Commander, which will give a -5 morale for all enemy units. The reason being is we really want to break up the enemy units as quickly as possible, because of course, you know, we do have access to Numidian cavalry, as you saw in section 3 of the battle against Rome. And the faster those units are and the quicker the units break up, the Numidian cavalry will be even more effective at chasing them down. So as Carthage, it's quite doable to, you know, fight battles that can completely annihilate an army. As you saw in section 3, we surrounded the Roman army, but of course, you know, if I was playing a little bit more seriously in that battle, I would have made the effort of using my Numidian cavalry to chase down stragglers, thereby completely eliminating the army. However, that being said and done, we are going to go ahead and see the effects of this, you know, of these buffs. And just for a simple comparison, as you can see over here, this unit has now moved up to 9 melee attack, 20 melee defense, up from 7 melee attack, 17 melee defense, and their base morale is at 53. And these units were comparable to those Libby Phoenician mercenary hoplite. But just take a look at the Libby Phoenician mercenary hoplite now. They have a 10 melee attack, 23 melee defense, alright, 53 morale, which is amazing. Now these guys have effectively become as good as the Royal Spartan Bodyguard in terms of stats, alright. That's how powerful it is. What's more is that you have significantly reduced the cost of hiring these troops, and of course also their upkeep cost has also significantly decreased, thanks to all of the skills that we have taken. And of course it's going to show higher than it would at the start of the game, because we own the entire world, and therefore our empire maintenance is at a crazy level, 196, which also means our army upkeep cost and so forth is also incredibly high. Of course, we cannot specialize the provinces to help assist with that. And of course, we haven't also researched any of the technologies to help with that army upkeep. But I will be showing before and after screenshots. So let's one by one have a look at some of the important units. Just for comparison, here's the Libby Phoenician mercenary hoplite right now. And I will be showing the before getting all of these skills. Meanwhile, I'm going to quickly move all the way over here to another army that I've created over here and pretty much do the same setup. We want this as well as this. Let's go for it. Get that. This getting a bit confusing right now because there's just so much going on. However, we want the stalwart defenders as well as keepers of the peace. We want both of the mercenary things. Let's go ahead. That should make it easy. And lastly, we want the general skills. So firstly, we'll select all of the individual skills, and then it should be easy just to simply level them up. And over here, get that movement speed, and finally get the Dread Commander. All right. Okay. Before we go ahead, we're going to move back to Africa, and I will show you that even the same has applied to all of our units over here. Just look at this mercenary Greek hoplite. 11 melee attack, 24 melee defense, 65 base morale. This is better than your Royal Spartan Bodyguard. And speaking of better than Royal Spartan Bodyguard, your mercenary heavy Celtic spearmen, 12 melee attack, 30 melee defense, and you know, 69 base morale. That is crazy. And next up, we can look at your mercenary Iberian champions, 27 melee attack, 15 melee defense, 69 morale. That's just how insane things can get. And finally, we can take a look at the mercenary naked spear throwers. 15 melee attack, 36 melee defense, and a 73 base morale. This is just how ridiculous your units can become as Carthage, especially your mercenary units. And with that, you know, we can see how powerful this build is for Carthage. And finally, I would like to show even the pikemen over here, the Macedonian mercenary pikemen. As you can see, they have a melee attack of 13, melee defense of 15, which is significantly higher than what it was previously. And of course, you know, this stat is even better than your silver shield pikemen with a 13 melee attack and a 15 melee defense. Of course, the army is completely leveled up in terms of traditions and of course general skills, so you have to keep that in mind. But just to let you know that your units can become even as effective as silver shield pikemen. Next up, you can see with the Agrarian axemen. Now these guys will slap. I mean, Agrarian axemen or Agrarian sellswords as they're called over here. I keep calling them axemen because that's the audio that they use in the game. However, with the Agrarian axemen, you know, they have a melee attack of 11 and a melee defense of 14. And now they have a melee attack of 16 and a melee defense of 18. And with the original stats of the Agrarian axemen, I have seen them get 600 to 800 kills per unit in a battle of 20 versus 20. These units can absolutely slap, and just with that increased melee attack and melee defense, imagine just how powerful these units will be, especially considering their weapon damage is insane. Their weapon damage is 35 in total, with armor penetration accounting for 15 of that. Meanwhile, if I even compare them to our you know, Iberian champions, although Iberian champions will have a much higher melee attack of 27, melee defense of 15, their overall weapon damage is only 30, right? So, and of course, a lot of it is not armor penetration, only 4. However, in comparison, the Agrarian axemen have 35, which is significant. So it's pretty much a toss-up between these two units. However, you know, 27 melee attack is nothing to scoff at. However, with that being said and done, you can see just how powerful the Carthaginian faction can be an S tier faction, even rivaling the might of Rome in its own way. And with that, I hope you all enjoyed the video. So I thank you all for watching. And if you like the video, then please like the video. And don't forget to subscribe if you are interested for more. Peace and love.